When you look at what we see this morning, the international jawboning, what would you suggest we should look for from Secretary Kerry's trip to Kiev?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, look, I think part of the problem for the United States and for Secretary Kerry in particular is that the United States as such does not have a huge amount of influence or leverage over Russia on this issue. For Russia, Ukraine, from Russia's perspective, Ukraine is an existential issue, both in terms of geopolitics and domestic politics. It simply matters more to Ukraine, rather to Russia than it does to the U.S., and Russia has more levers of influence directly on the ground in Ukraine.
Right.
What Kerry can do is talk about sanctions, but economic sanctions won't have much of an effect because the U.S.-Russia economic relationship is not very deep, and political sanctions or visa sanctions is not something that will move Putin tremendously.
There seems to be a lot of jawboning this morning. Is it coordinated? When you look at all the headlines coming across the Bloomberg, is it a coordinated effort or an ad hoc effort between Sweden, Germany, the U.S., the IMF, and the others?
I think there's certainly room for better coordination, and I think the problem with coordination now is that not everyone's interests are precisely aligned. The Europeans, as you know, have a much deeper economic and energy relationship with Russia, which bounds their ability to really enter into what could be a sort of mutually assured destruction economic scenario with the Russians.
And that's an important point here, Richard Falkenrath. You mentioned this earlier. Explain to us the hydrocarbon linkage between Russia, Ukraine, and Germany.
Well, I mean, first, Russia's incredibly dependent economically on its oil and gas exports. A large fraction of those go through pipelines, some of which are in Ukraine, to the European Union, which gets about 30% of its gas consumption directly from Russian suppliers. So that is by far the most important economic relationship in that part of the world.
The map of the hydrocarbons, Scarlett, looks like your hockey road trip over the weekend.
It's a bit of a mess, but everything
that.
goes through Ukraine. That's the issue.
Yeah.
Alex, to what extent are the seeds being sown for another Cold War?
Well, I think we have to be very careful in how we describe Cold War versus hot war. Clearly, this is an issue on which Russia and the U.S. and Europe will have to come to some kind of understanding, or there could be a very serious conflict, you know, right on the border of Europe. I mean, the idea of a Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine could turn very ugly very quickly, and a solution has to be found quickly.
Well, and I continue to wonder about the economic impact with the European banks. I mean, the Russian banks said that two-thirds of the $56 billion that flowed out of the country in 2012 could possibly be traced to illegal activity. It seems like the European banks would have, therefore, a reason to maybe impound some of those assets and punish Russia in a different way if they cared to. Is there any suggestion that that's on the table?
There's been some very vague talk about sanctions against certain Russian elites. We don't have any real clarity on that now. It certainly is true that one way to potentially get Putin's attention more clearly would be to go after the assets of key Russian elites who support him. That is certainly something that could be considered. I don't have any information on how far that's gone, though.